true honor and privilege for me to be here today. The organizations with which I'm associated, the GASB and Government Accounting Standards Board and the FASAB, the Federal Accounting Standards Board, have a policy that we always, when we speak to audiences, we always have to say that what we're saying does not represent their views. When I talk, they send me a special email reminding me of that. And if Dean Gilligan were here, I would tell him, I would remind him about that we have a tenure system at the University of Texas. Today I'd like to talk about the U.S. Fiscal crisis, and there are a few themes that I'd like to set forth. I mean, first of all, we're in serious trouble. There's no question that we need fundamental reforms. But I want to emphasize that there are no simple answers to this problem. And a central point that I want to leave you with is anybody who tells you that there are simple answers just simply doesn't know what they're talking about. This is the political season, and of course I'm going to try to be non-political. But I would emphasize at the very outset that if anybody tells you that you can reduce taxes, preserve Medicare and Medicare, preserve Social Security and Medicare as it is today, and not cut spending, then they're simply living in a dream world. I mean, you can't do everything of that sort. The United States today faces both a short-term problem and a long-term problem, and that's what makes it tough. And the solution to the short-term problem is not necessarily, in fact, it's most certainly not, the solution to the long-term problem. I believe, I have no problem with those who argue for U.S. exceptionalism. But like it or not, the country today is not the same country as the U.S. of 1950. Yes, nobody is, I don't believe that we're necessarily on a decline, but the fact of the matter is the rest of the world has changed. We're in a much more competitive environment today than 50 or 60 years ago, and that's obvious. The problems that we face today are holistic. I mean, like it or not, we're a nation, we're of intergovernmental, corporate, and not-for-profit dependencies. And therefore, you can't solve one problem without solving other problems. You have to look at this, the nation's fiscal crisis, from a holistic point of view. And further, like it or not, we're not going to grow our way out of the fiscal problem. We're going to have to make certain measures. We're going to have to raise taxes, lower spending, and probably some combination of the two. Further, nobody is opposed to eliminating fraud, waste, and abuse. But that in itself is not going to do it. Like it or not, we're going to have to make very critical choices. We're going to have to decide how much of our gross national product we want to devote to public goods, how much to private goods. And obviously, as we sit in traffic in Austin, it occurs to us that, gee, there has to be this balance between the two. I'm going to talk mainly about government accounting today. And at the federal level, believe it or not, federal accounting is not an oxymoron. Each year, the government Treasury Department issues a statement, the financial report of the U.S. government. And I have a short form, a citizen's guide to this report on the table over there, or if you've gotten it, I urge you to read it. And many of the charts that I'm going to display today have come from, exactly from this report. The standards, the accounting standards, are quite reasonable. And they are quite rigorous for the most part. That differs from the budget. There are no generally accepted budgeting standards, and all the gimmicks that you hear about, all the artificial estimates and assumptions, they typically are associated with the budget, not with the annual report. And you'll notice here, the red line represents the deficit per the financial statements. The white line, that per the annual report. Typically, not always, because there are all sorts of adjustments, typically the report of the deficit under the budget is far less than that in the financial statements. And this is just a simple reconciliation. This year, the main differences are for various accruals. The budget, and here's the key, the budget is on a cash basis of accounting. The annual report is on an accrual basis of accounting. And therefore, it's under the cash basis of accounting that you can time your revenues and time your expenses and therefore obfuscate fiscal reality. Having said all that, this report is audited by the GAO, the Government Accountability Office. Per a 1994 act, all agencies, per the Government Management and Reform Act of 1994, all agencies are required to produce financial statements and have them audited. Today, that's 16 years after this act is passed, the government is still unable to get an unqualified opinion on its financial statements by the GAO. That's mainly because of the Defense Department. The Defense Department still has not been able to get a clean opinion from their auditors. It's also a result of various projections to which the GAO takes exception, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's look at the government's net position. The negative net position is something like $14.7 trillion. Now, that net position, that debt, if you look at the debt per this chart, I don't know if you can you read that in the back? And I can't even read it on my screen. But nonetheless, the federal debt shown here is $10.2 trillion. Now, that debt is just the debt held by the public. It excludes intergovernmental debt, most of which is held by the trust funds. 2.4 trillion is in Social Security. A total of $4.7 trillion in debt is the total intergovernmental debt, and therefore the commonly bandied about figure today is that the federal debt is about $15 trillion. It was recently, the debt ceiling was recently September, was increased to 15.2 trillion. Now, this debt, and this I'll emphasize this at length in just a few minutes, this debt excludes social insurance. And that, of course, is well, to get ahead of ourselves, that adds either 30 or $45 trillion to the debt, not a trivial amount. We'll talk about why that is in a few minutes. But, you know, when I went to school in ancient times, we were told, don't worry about the federal debt because we owe it to ourselves. Who held the debt? You know, you and I held the debt. We had savings bonds, and you know, insurance companies and banks held U.S. government bonds. Today, as this chart indicates, over 50% of the debt is held outside the United States. Now, for some people, for some economists, that's not a problem. You know, they say, look, you don't really have to worry about China suddenly cashing in all its debt, suddenly saying, we're not going to lend you anymore, because that wouldn't be in their interests. And they're probably right about that. But the way I see it, what China can do is they can gradually wean themselves off of U.S. debt. And what are they going to do with their dollars then? They can invest it in U.S. corporations. So then they'll own our U.S. corporations. And maybe I'm a bit cynical, but it seems to me that the parties that control U.S. corporations also control U.S. politics, or at least they certainly have a major impact on U.S. political decisions. And it's not, of course, clear that they'll necessarily make those decisions in the interests of us rather than them. Well, where does the money go? And here's the big problem. I mean, if you look at the federal expenditures, where does it go? 24% goes to health and human services, Social Security, Medicare and the like. 21% to Social Security. 20% to defense. 7% to interest, and that leaves, and some to Veterans Affairs, and that leaves 23% to all other departments, all other expenditures. And I don't know if you can read this, but this is the statement of net cost of the U.S. government. So as I said, most of it is non-discretionary. So all right, maybe some of you don't like the State Department. You think we give too much in foreign aid. Fine, eliminate it. You know what? The entire State Department is 0.6% of the budget. You don't like the Education Department. You think that should be devolved to the states. Fine, 1.5% of the budget. You don't like energy? 1.2% of the budget. That's 3 departments. I can't remember anymore. And of course, I've had those written down as well. But let's see where the problem is. What this graph does is this projects out the receipts and non-interest expenses, non-interest expenditures for the next umpteen years, after 280. So what do we notice? That based on current policy, this is all current policy, some of which, by the way, is unrealistic, as we'll talk about in a moment. But the deficit continues. All right, it's not increasing all that much. But let's face it, the deficit doesn't have to increase all that much. As long as we're still running a deficit, what happens to the debt? The debt is constantly increasing. And therefore, what's going to happen to interest costs? Interest costs are going to continually increase. That's one point that I want to make. The other is, notice that revenues and expenses are almost behave opposite to one another. That, of course, tells us something. It says that when the economy is poor, then what happens? Expenditures go up. We see this dramatically over here in 2008 to actually the present time. Here are the expenditures. Here are the revenues. In other words, today, we not only have a crisis that we're spending too much, we're also not collecting as much in revenue. And many of those expenditures, some of those expenditures, are obviously attributable to the policies of the current administration. But actually, most of them are not. Most of them are simply a result of increases in entitlements or entitlement-like programs, such as unemployment insurance, which obviously goes up when we're in a recession. Take a look at this from a slightly different perspective. This just shows, again, the projections out. The blue is defense. The red over here, this is the discretionary spending, and it's not even all discretionary. But this is spending other than defense, Social Security in green, Medicaid in blue, and Medicare. And the black line, that's the revenue. But here's where the problem comes in. Now we add an interest, and now you see what's happening. Now notice the scale over here is percent of GDP. So you project out, my God, we're looking at close to 38% of GDP on interest itself. Obviously, that's not sustainable. And if you look at, same type of chart, if you just look at the federal debt. Convention says, gee, you get around 100%, you're pushing the envelope a bit. Well, just look at that. You project this out without substantive changes, we're looking at 250 and 300% of gross national product will be debt will be 200 to 300% of GDP. This chart simply indicates what the revenues are. And the point that I want to make here is that this top line over here, where it says non-earmarked funds, or under revenue, the largest amount is individual income taxes. Now, individual income taxes, first we have the non-earmarked funds, and then the earmarked funds. The earmarked funds are Social Security and Medicare. When the federal government uses the term earmarked funds, they don't talk about earmarks like special bills for a particular constituency. Earmarked funds are funds that are dedicated collections. And in fact, the Federal Accounting Standards Board is about to use that term, do away with earmark, because of the confusion. So I would note, though, that Social Security and Medicare are considered taxes and not pension collections. Further, I would note that compare the individual taxes to corporate income taxes. Corporate income taxes are pretty low, relatively speaking, which says that playing around, increasing corporate taxes or decreasing corporate taxes is maybe sound fiscal policy for good reasons, but it's not going to have much of an impact on the federal deficit. Now we get to the big elephant in the room, and that's the social insurance. And what this chart is, this is the present value of the future net payments, net of collections. And there are various ways that this can be calculated, but the way the Social Security Administration calculates this, they do it over a 75-year period, taking into account the anticipated collections less the legislative payouts. And so for Social Security, you notice we have a present value. Notice the debt, in effect. This, we call this the debt. $9.1 trillion. For Medicare, it's considerably low. Medicare and Part A and Part B, it's considerably larger than that. For railroad retirement and black lung, that's included in Social Security. Those are trivial amounts. I wouldn't worry about that. But then we come to the summary of it all. What does it all mean? If presented, if calculated on what they call a closed group percentage, then it is $45 trillion. If on an open group, it's 33. Now, what's the difference between the two? A closed group just takes into account those individuals who are currently in the system. The open group takes into account those who will join the system as well. In other words, it takes into account children, or actually the still unborn, and immigrants and the like, who will eventually join the system. The open group is usually lower than the closed group because it includes amounts that they'll pay in, but since it only goes for 75 years, it excludes certain the payments that those people will get after they retire. But that's 33 or $45 trillion. Now, that is not included in any of the official statements of the debt. including the balance sheet that I just showed you, which had a net position negative 14 trillion. Why not? This happened to be a very, very sensitive issue in establishing generally accepted government accounting principles. And why is that? There are some people, the Federal Accounting Standards Board has 9 members, 3 of whom represent the administration, and they have veto power. So they didn't want the Social Security figure or social insurance figure on the balance sheet. The independent members did, and eventually there was a compromise. What they decided to do is have a statement of social insurance, which is a basic statement included in the annual report, but they would not include the liability on the official balance sheet. So that doesn't trouble me one bit, because the fact of the matter is anybody who can add can figure out what the total deficit is, for total debt is, taking into account the social insurance. Now, what's the problem? Well, first of all, Social Security will run out by 2036. Last year, for the first time, the amount of payments in Social Security exceeded the collections. Up until then, Social Security was actually reducing the deficit. That's going to change right now. But Social Security, let's face it, is not the big problem faced by the United States. We can solve Social Security relatively easily. Increase the age limit, raise the cap, etc. If we had the political will, we could do that. But I mean, what's extremely troublesome is it's easy to fix Social Security, and yet we've been unable to do it so far. If you look at Part A of Medicare is is the hospital insurance. We see the same type of effect. The expenditures are exceeding the income for as long out as we can project. Similarly, Part A also will run out. There's a trust fund for Part A, and that's going to run out by 2024. Part B is not funded by a trust fund. That's by premiums. And once again, what do we see? The expenditures far exceed any of the revenues. And up until now, we haven't had much of a problem. But look what's going to happen into the future. So these are issues, which we obviously are going to have to deal with. Take Part B and D as a percentage of GDP, and this alone, is approaching 5% from 1 or 2% what it is now. And what this represents, this difference, this represents a gap that has to be filled with federal expenditures. Now, but the trouble with all this is, all these projections are based on current policy. The reality is, everybody knows that current policy is not realistic. When I say everybody, I mean even the trustees of Medicare and Social Security. In their report, the trustees say the assumptions are not realistic. So, for example, what assumption is not realistic? Right now, per official policy, payments to physicians are going to decrease over time. Everyone knows that's not going to happen. And in fact, they're considering, I think they just fixed it the other day, or they're talking about fixing it the other day. So that's an unrealistic assumption. What if you extended the income tax and the estate and gift tax provisions that are supposed to sunset at the end of the year? Current policy, current projections assume that those will be sunsetted. They're not going to be, probably. What about the AMT? If you index that for inflation, as no doubt is going to happen, that's going to add to it. So the point is that what this does, it adds to the extra costs of, this indicates the added costs of changing the policy, changing the assumptions to something more realistic. And this other chart, and this, by the way, is the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office says this is the percentage of the debt adjusted for, this is represents the deficits adjusted for those changes in assumptions. We haven't yet spoken about other factors which are not included in the balance sheet. So, for example, we have various contingencies. You know, the reality is we always talk about what about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the FDIC. The fact is that they're really not terribly significant. I mean, for an accountant to say, gee, $316 billion is not really material, may be a bit odd, but the reality is when you're talking about trillions, $300 billion isn't that much. But the point is there are still these contingencies out there for Pension Benefit Corporation, FDIC, and Fannie Mae. Then, of course, as I said, you can't just look at the federal deficit in isolation. We've got to look at so many of the other problems that are facing the country. I mean, look, we've got consumer debt, $7,800 per capita, and that doesn't even include any real estate debt. We've had a decline in manufacturing. It was 25% of GDP in the early 1980s, and it's something like 11% today. We focus on the financial sector. Financial sector has increased from 2.1% to 8.4%. Now listen, obviously many of you are in the financial sector, and I at McCombs clearly have, clearly would hate to say too much negative about the financial sector, but I mean, let's face it. Manufacturing derivatives is not exactly the same as manufacturing automobiles or televisions or what have you. We have a trade deficit. Yes, it's improved slightly owing to the recession, but it's still much, much larger than it ever was, certainly before 1999. Now, the question then is, what can we do about all of this? And I call this, truth and consequences. What's realistic? Well, first of all, a proposal has been made that we pass a balanced budget amendment. Now, that's going to solve the problems. Well, there are economists who will argue that there are good, sound economic reasons for not having a balanced budget. They would say that what happens is you're going to have to cut expenditures in times of recession, and that's the worst thing you can do. I'm not going to get into that. I leave that to the economists. I focus on this from an accounting perspective. First of all, I said the budget is on a cash basis of accounting. And that means you can do all sorts of manipulations. And we could spend hours talking about the history of federal gimmickry. I mean, state and local governments balance their budgets with gimmicks, believe me. But where do they learn them from? They learn them from the federal government. Secondly, the federal budget is based on all sorts of assumptions, so many of which are artificial. We have, in recent years, many of the budgets were balanced by, by leaving out key expenditures. And then we got supplementals for those, so they weren't included in the original budget. For example, the last several years of the Iraq War were funded by supplemental appropriations, not included in the budget. President Clinton included the census, which is constitutionally mandated every 10 years, right? Excluded that from the budget, treating that as sort of an unexpected event. The trouble is the government, the federal government, unlike states, does not have a capital budget. We don't distinguish between capital budgeting and operating budgets. So when people say, well, the average family has to balance their budget, that's not exactly true. I mean, we all borrow for major capital expenditures, our homes and cars perhaps. And of course, state and local governments don't include capital expenditures in their budget. And then, of course, the budget, believe me, is so complex that there's no way that one can agree on what the budget is. At the meeting that I was at, just yesterday, we were talking about this. It was proposed that the federal government, in its annual report, have a budget versus actual comparison. And the reality is you can't do it. The budget is so complicated that it's impossible. For example, some costs are budgeted for a 5 or 10 year period. Others are permanent entitlements. So what do you do with all that? A balanced budget will be the Full Employment Act for attorneys, unquestionably. Any attempt at enforcing a balanced budget amendment will unquestionably just involve the federal government in protracted litigation. So, again, it's a simple way, it's an easy way. Let's balance the budget. As an accountant, not an economist, it's not going to work. Then there are other things we can do, I suppose, that we're talking about. Gee, let's reduce educational expenditures. Well, for heaven's sakes, I mean, right now, out of 34 major countries, we're ranked 14th in reading, 17th in science, 25th in mathematics. Do we really want to spend less on education in our country? I mean, clearly, that, at least to me at least, that's hardly an acceptable outcome. Or, and here's the big problem. 27 to 32% of state revenues come from the federal government. What that is saying is that as we solve our federal problems, what's going to happen? They're just going to devolve the problems. The costs are going to devolve down to the states. And the fact of the matter is that today, the states, although they're doing a little bit better than last year, they're continuing to improve. Fact is, the states are still in serious trouble. If you look at situation, 29 states have projected or have addressed or in the process of addressing major shortfalls for 2013. Obviously, Texas is one of them. But of course, the big problem that we face in state and local governments are pensions. The gap, the unfunded liabilities of pensions are anywhere from $1 trillion to $4 trillion. Depends how you measure them. But the one thing you don't want to do is to look at the financial statements of state and local governments today, because their balance sheets do not report the unfunded liabilities. And in fact, even if you look at the notes, the computation that's in the notes is probably not adequate. Now, as we speak, the Government Accounting Standards Board is revising its standards pertaining to how pensions should be reported. And I guarantee when this statement is issued, you're going to see huge, huge increases in the liabilities of state and local governments. And what we'll be forcing local governments to do is put their liabilities on the balance sheet. The unfunded liability is going to have to be reported on the balance sheet. What's most interesting about this is we're changing the way governments that participate in cost-sharing plans have to report their pensions. A cost-sharing plan is one where, let's say you have school districts. The school districts all participate in a plan that's maintained by the state. Well, right now, these state plans may be seriously underfunded. Well, who's going to have to make up that underfunding? It's going to have to be the members, the school districts. Well, right now, they don't report either on their balance sheet or on their notes. They don't report any liability. So if this rule goes into effect, they're now going to have to report their share of the state's or the pension plan's liability. So now, this is going to throw school districts and many local districts into a state of chaos. Everyone believed that these school districts were nice, were fiscally sound. When you add in the pensions, all of a sudden, they're not going to look so fiscally sound. Now, worse than pensions is other post-employment benefits. Those plans, in state and local governments, those plans cannot generally be abrogated by the government. It depends, of course, on the constitution of the state and on the particular statutes. But generally speaking, state and local governments cannot back away from those plans, as can private corporations. Those plans have traditionally been unfunded. Those are on a pay-as-you-go basis. That is a major liability, a major obligation, which only recently has to be reported in the notes to financial statements, but not on their actual balance sheets. So here's the problem. So what's another solution, to the fiscal crisis? Well, everyone says, gee, let's switch. Maybe governments should switch, and I'm talking about federal government as well as state and local governments. They said, let's switch to defined contribution plans. Well, the reality is that defined contribution plans this is totally backwards, what I've got written here. Defined benefit, speak to any actuary, and they will say that defined benefit plans are far more efficient than defined contribution plans. And when you think about it, it's obvious why. If you have a defined contribution plan and you're 65 years old, you have to figure that you may live, if you're lucky, another 35, maybe 40 more, another 30, maybe 35 more years. So you have to have that much in your plan. If you're in a defined benefit plan, which averages all of the risk, then you can figure you only need enough for maybe 17 more years. So a switch to defined contribution plans is basically a decrease in compensation. The evidence shows that the average 401k balance of employees in their 60s with more than 30 years of employment experience and 30 years in the plan is only $210,000. Now, I've seen different numbers, but they're all, make the similar point. What's $210,000 going to do for somebody who's 65 years old? Doesn't provide very much in the way of income. And of course, the problem is we're talking about reducing Social Security one way or another, not necessarily reducing it, but limiting the increase, at the same time that we want to switch to these defined contribution plans. So what we're saying is we're going to have a real problem with the elderly in a few years. And of course, we all know what the demographics are looking like. Just look at the charts where today and in the future we're going to have far, far fewer workers than beneficiaries. Look, that doesn't mean we can't reform pensions, and we've got to reform pensions, no question about it. I mean, there are obvious things that have to be done. Eliminate spiking, where police officers work 60 hours, 80 hours a week in their last year to build up their overtime. Surely certain early retirement policies make no sense whatsoever. We all hear about people who double dip. That's got to be eliminated. And then, of course, as I indicated, we've got to improve the accounting so we get truth in accounting with respect to pensions, and I think we're making progress in there. It's often said, gee, let's reduce the compensation of public sector employees. Look, there's no question but that public sector wages are less than those No, that's, again, I don't know how when I wrote this, I must have been sleeping. Public sector wages at certain levels, are higher than those in the private sector. It depends on the, well, no, wait, I misspoke, I'm sorry. Public sector wages, typically, except at certain low levels, are less than those in the private sector. It's the benefits which are much higher, tend to be much higher in the public sector. The problem is, how do you measure that? And that's complicated, but a very recent study by the Research Center, Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, which is very, very good, they've done a study, and they say that on balance, private sector wages are about 4% higher than those in the public sector. So private sector wages are higher than those in the public sector. There's no question that at certain managerial levels, the private sector wages are much higher than those in the public sector. This was in my class at the LBJ school last year. I asked a student who was a major in the Army, to make this point, I said, how much does General Petraeus earn? And his answer was, you know, I really don't know, but I can assure you that it's a lot less than his translator, who's a private contractor, earns. So, I mean, reducing compensation for public sector employees doesn't make all that sense. I mean, I'm a capitalist. I believe in competition, and I believe that you have to pay competitive wages if you want competent people. Well, then we can say, you know, what are other things that are being done right now? You know, cutting expenses on infrastructure. Well, that's great. You know, if you, tell you what, wait till 5:30 this evening and drive on one of the Texas highways, the Austin highways, you know, MOPAC or I-35, and then say that we should be cutting our expenditures on infrastructure. You know, the American Association of Civil Engineers issues a report card every few years on our infrastructure, and you know, their grades are, on average, are a D. So there's little room for cutting that. Anybody who's flown recently knows that our airports are not exactly in great shape either. I mean, what are some other things that are being talked about? Well, you know, I'd say all sorts of meaningless gestures for federal pay freezes. You know, the Obama administration did that. That's not going to solve any problem. I mean, it may be good politics, but it's not sound economics. Of course, the traditional way of improving things are just accounting gimmicks, including all these off-the-balance sheet borrowings that we engage in. You know, focus on issues of no financial consequence. In other words, look, you don't like National Public Radio, you can have Congress spend weeks debating National Public Radio, but it's not solving any fiscal problem. There may be good reasons to abolish, not to fund National Public Radio, but solving the fiscal crisis is certainly not one of them. But therefore, what can be done? Well, look, Medicare, as I said, is the critical problem. Healthcare today represents 18% of our economy. It's increasing at a rate of about 9% a year. A family policy costs $15,000 today. Now, somebody's bearing that cost. And these medical costs are having a major effect, not only on governments, but on private corporations, even universities. Colleges and universities have to pay an extraordinary high cost in medical care. There's an apocryphal story that the chairman of the board of one of the major automobile companies asked its board of directors, you know, who do you think is our major supplier? And of course, they all guessed, you know, steel companies, tire companies, whatever. No, the major supplier was Blue Cross Blue Shield or the equivalent thereof. So if we're going to tackle medical costs, Medicare, you can't just devolve the cost down to the states, because the states will then devolve it down to the counties. The counties will devolve it down to the emergency rooms. We have to get a handle on health care reform. That's a tough one. Politically, obviously, it's dynamite. But one way or another, we're going to have to do a number of things. Eliminate Medicare abuse, and apparently there's a lot of that. We've got to reduce administrative costs. Every one of us know you go to a doctor, and for every doctor, there are 4 people out there filing insurance claims, which means there's another 4 people at the other end with the insurance company doing the same thing. We've got to move more towards electronic records. We've got to improve the delivery of services. We've got to find some way to provide patient incentives for cost reduction. Just the other week, I was in the my doctor told me, you don't really need this blood test, but if you want it, go ahead and get it. Well, the fact of the matter is, it was free to me, and a blood test takes 5 minutes of my time. I said, sure, why not? No incentive, whatever, to reduce the cost. There's a marvelous book by T.R. Reid, a reporter for the Washington Post. He goes around to various countries with a shoulder problem and sees how he's treated in the various countries. In France, he said, yeah, you have a card. He said, you go into a doctor's office, there are no medical records, no financial records. You go in and you give a card, and that's it. All your information is on that card. The billing is automatic. Well, I'm not getting into issues of whether there should be a single payer a system or not. But all I'm saying is we've got to do something to reduce health care costs. We can't go on as we're doing, and we're not going to solve the federal fiscal problems until we get a handle on health care reform. Obviously, another step we have to do is to reform the tax code. Everyone knows this. Right now there's talk of let's review all these tax expenditures, the special provisions. No doubt we have to do that. I'm not going to get into questions of whether we should lower rates or raise them. But the fact of the matter is, right now, we've got a short-term problem. And we've got to stimulate the economy. And I would suggest probably, if you want to raise rates, you've got to do it on those areas that will have minimal impact, will have no impact on investment or consumer demand. We've got to, like it or not, reform our tax code to provide incentives for research, investment, and hiring, certainly in the short term. We've got to develop, right now, we've got to think of some sort of targeted stimulus programs, in my view at least. But targeted stimulus programs, they increase current costs and they add to the deficit. They don't, and they do nothing, of course, to solve the long-term problem. So, the fact of the matter is that Simpson-Bowles, for example, was a good start. Simpson-Bowles said, look, we're going to need some combination of revenue enhancements and spending cuts. And that seems to me to be the way forward. We're going to have to compromise, but we're going to have to make those tough decisions. Seems to me we can't go around saying, gee, let's eliminate government. By any measure, government has to be part of the solution. That's our system today. So we're going to have to find the proper role, get that proper balance for government and business. And finally, I'm not terribly pessimistic, not necessarily pessimistic. I believe that we can do this, but I would say we can't do it with our present political system. We can't do it when you have this polarization. Somehow or other, we've got to come to a point where we can make some reasonable decisions, some compromises, and move forward. Well, anyway, thank you so much. As I said, it was a really honor for me to be here.